Night of the 13th of November, 1942, north of Guadalcanal. The sea lay unnervingly calm beneath a low, moonless sky, its surface reflecting only the faint red haze drifting from distant fires still smoldering on the horizon. The Japanese transport column pushed through this darkness at a slow, deliberate 8 knots, each hull weighted with infantry replacements, crates of ammunition, and disassembled field guns packed so tightly that the ships rode low and sluggish. On the bridge of the lead transport, a staff officer felt the silence like a pressure on his lungs, broken only by the rhythmic slap of waves and the occasional clatter of unsecured cargo shifting below. Ahead, the screening destroyers drifted outward in long, shallow arcs, their engines throttled back to 20 knots as their captains scanned the void for American surface groups rumored to be regrouping after the previous night's brutal engagements. Shortly after 02:00, the stillness fractured. A dull, distant vibration quivered through the Iran unmistakable drone of multiple aircraft engines, rising and falling as if swept on the wind. Before anyone on the transports could pinpoint the source, the lead destroyer suddenly surged forward, its bow knifing up as it accelerated past 25 knots, then 30, spray bursting across its decks. The others followed in rapid succession, each turning sharply and vanishing into the night in streaks of foaming phosphorescence. Within minutes, the entire escort screen had disappeared, leaving only the lumbering merchant ships adrift in exposed water. A staff officer on the transport Cito Maru later recalled the moment with a tightening sense of disbelief, convinced he must have misread the situation as the wake of the last destroyer dissolved into the dark. He knew the doctrine as well as any naval man. Japanese destroyers were the fleet's greyhounds, designed for speed, torpedo attacks, and hit-and-run tactics. Yet on this night their agility became a curse rather than a shield, for the transports could not match even half their pace. The faster the destroyers fled to intercept what they believed to be incoming American reconnaissance, the more catastrophically they abandoned the very vessels they were tasked to defend. Minutes after the escorts vanished, faint specks of light appeared low on the northern horizon. American scout planes, catching occasional reflections of their own navigation lamps as they banked for another pass. To the Japanese officer, watching them grow, the truth settled like ice in his stomach. The convoy had been left alone, slow and exposed, and the Americans had already begun to peel back the darkness. This widening gap between escort speed and transport vulnerability, first glimpsed in moments like these, marked the early stage of a strategic imbalance that would stretch into a year-long logistical catastrophe. The scout planes circled wider and the transports braced for the morning that would reveal them fully. The roots of this flaw pointed backward to decisions made months earlier, chain of choices that the next section will trace from the campaign's earliest planning. June 1942 settled over the South Pacific with a humidity so thick it clung to uniforms and maps alike. And across the sprawling arc of newly conquered islands, Japanese commanders felt an unease that no battlefield victory could suppress. From Buna and Leon, the New Guinea coast, to the scattered outposts of the Northern Solomons, garrisons that had surged forward during the first months of expansion were now trapped within a tightening vice of supply needs. Ammunition expenditure far exceeded projections. Construction battalions demanded lumber and cement to fortify airstrips, and thousands of soldiers required food in quantities the region's poor soils could not provide. Tokyo's expectation was simple. The Imperial Navy would deliver everything through standard transport convoys, moving outward from Rabaul-like spokes from a wheel. But the reality was already slipping beyond reach. The merchant fleet assigned to the South Seas Detachment had been battered by losses in the Coral Sea in May, and further eroded by American aircraft and submarines prowling around New Guinea. What remained were slow, underpowered cargo ships that struggled to maintain even 8 knots in open water. Their plodding pace made them easy targets for U.S. submarines, increasingly active off the Solomons, and 4 reconnaissance aircraft, now operating from Espiritu Santo and Henderson Field, airfields that had flipped the region's surveillance map almost overnight. Every voyage demanded luck, and fewer arrived intact. Japanese destroyers, sleek with high-pressure turbines and built for 13-knot attacks, seemed a theoretical solution as escorts. In practice, they presented their own paradox. Their engines consumed fuel at such a rate that captains were forced to throttle back to avoid burning through precious reserves, and many destroyers had to detach early simply to reach refueling points before running dry. The result was a pattern repeated across the early summer, transports limping forward, alone, while their escorts raced ahead or peeled away, their designed speed making them unsuitable for the very task imposed on them. By July, reports of moldy rations, weakened troops, and stalled construction flooded headquarters at Admirals debated abandoning the use of conventional transports entirely, yet the Army refused to release faster merchant hulls or adjust its rigid supply timetables. Within these arguments, the core contradiction of Japan's South Pacific strategy became impossible to ignore. Its finest warships could sprint across entire island chains, but its supply system crawled, Staff officers studying convoy schedules during the summer saw the widening gap with growing alarm, understanding that it would force a drastic shift. That shift, the reassignment of frontline destroyers as emergency high transports, forms the next stage of the crisis. Night after night, in the weeks following the American seizure of Henderson Field on the 20th of August 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal took on a new and desperate rhythm, with daylight sailings rendered suicidal under the reach of Marine and Navy aircraft operating from the captured airstrip. Japanese logisticians were forced into an abrupt and radical transformation. Conventional transports were withdrawn, their smoking wrecks already littering Iron Bedham Sound, and the Imperial Navy turned instead to its swiftest assets, frontline destroyers, to shoulder the burden of sustaining the 17th Army ashore. What began as an emergency improvisation soon hardened into a nightly ritual of speed and peril, a system that American observers would eventually label the Tokyo Express. The destroyers selected for these missions were among the most advanced in the world: Asasio and Fubuki-class ships, capable of 35 to 36 knots, even with their decks crowded by oil drums lashed down with rope and chain. Their orders were simple but punishing: run down the slot at maximum speed, arrive off Guadalcanal under full darkness, drop cargo-loaded drums overboard for troops to retrieve, then race north again before dawn, expose them to American aircraft. The logic seemed sound at first glance. Velocity, Japanese planners believed, could outrun American reconnaissance and preserve the lifeline that daytime convoys could no longer guarantee. But within days, the shortcomings surfaced. A destroyer, however fast, could never carry the tonnage of a transport ship. Drum drop methods were wasteful and treacherous. Currents dragged away supplies before they could be hooked, and soldiers wading into the surf often recovered only a fraction of what was sent. Worse still, each mission devoured fuel at a rate that alarmed logistics officers in the home islands, especially as tanker sinkings in the East Indies sharply reduced Japan's crude oil flow. By early September, the paradox was unmistakable. Elite destroyers built for torpedo attacks and fleet engagements were being consumed by courier work, their engines burning out hours on runs that delivered barely enough rice and ammunition to keep Guadalcanal's garrison functional. Meanwhile, the Army continued submitting requests for full-scale transport convoys, timelines and quantities that no longer matched naval reality. Because destroyers could reach speeds far beyond anything merchant hulls could manage, they rapidly became detached from the broader supply system, surging ahead or operating independently. This widening mismatch between strategic expectation and logistical capability grew more dangerous with each passing week, setting the stage for the first catastrophic collision between speed, improvisation, and American interdiction. That collision, brewing in the waters near Tassafaronga, would reveal just how brittle the Tokyo Express truly was. The night of the 29th of November 1942 settled over the waters off Tassafaronga with a thick haze that smelled of rain and cordite. Drifting low across the black surface, where Japan's second transport convoy crept southward. The convoy was an awkward hybrid born of inter-service disagreement. The Army insisted that heavy artillery rounds and engineering stores could only be moved by small transports and Daihatsu landing barges, slow craft that rarely exceeded 6 or 7 knots. The Navy, bound by orders, assigned destroyer escorts led by the veteran Takanami, a ship designed to slash through the ocean at over 30 knots, yet now forced to idle at a crawl. Her turbines, built for speed, burned fuel inefficiently at low power, and the column struggled to maintain cohesion as the larger ships yawed in the swell. Officers aboard Takanami felt the strain long before contact, aware that every mile covered at this pace drained precious fuel, while delivering almost none of the speed-based protection they were expected to provide. Shortly before midnight, while the convoy approached the entrance to Iron Bedham Sound, American cruisers of Task Force 67 moved in from the east, guided by radar that swept the darkness with mechanical precision. The first indication the Japanese destroyer captains received was a flare of star shells blooming overhead, followed by the whistle of incoming fire. Instinct toned through months of night fighting forced the destroyers to do exactly what they had been built to do: accelerate sharply, twist away from gunfire, and prepare to launch torpedoes. In seconds, the escorts surged to 25 knots, then 30, their wakes carving luminous streaks across the water. But the convoy behind them could not follow. The barges and small transports, blind in the glare and too slow to maneuver, remained outlined beneath the white glare of star shells. American shells found them almost immediately. Barges erupted into fireballs as fuel drums detonated, while the small transports splintered under concentrated cruisers. Survivors clung to debris as flaming oil spread across the surface, the roar of burning cargo drowning their calls from the destroyers racing ahead. Several officers later wrote that the horror behind them was visible only as intermittent flashes, proof that their speed had granted survival but delivered failure. When reports reached Rabaul days later, staff officers noticed the same chilling line repeated across multiple accounts: the destroyers had lived because they were too fast to remain with the vessels they were ordered to protect. The Convoy had not been defeated by American firepower alone, but by the widening structural gap between Japan's sleek warships and its slow, vulnerable supply craft. That insight began circulating through combined fleet briefings, raising urgent questions about how future convoys, heavier and even more essential, could possibly survive as American air power and radar tightened its grip over the Solomon Sea. Dawn never fully broke on the 8th of December, 1942, as a low ceiling of tropical cloud sagged over the waters north of shore, muting the horizon into a gray smear through which Japan's newest reinforcement convoy began its slow, uncertain push toward Guadalcanal. The column was a patchwork of necessity rather than design: converted freighters with tired engines, small transports loaded down with ammunition crates, and barge tenders towing strings of Daihatsu craft that wallowed in the swell. Their speeds ranged from 6 to 10 knots, and their wakes barely rippled the surface. On the charts in Rabaul, this convoy represented a last attempt to stabilize the collapsing front. But to the officers watching the column leave Shortland anchorage, it already looked vulnerable, too slow, too exposed, and too dependent on warships designed for an entirely different rhythm of combat. The destroyers, Cherokee, Uranami, and their consorts formed the outer screen, ordered to maintain position with the convoy until the final approach through the lower slot. Yet almost immediately, their captains confronted a dilemma impossible to resolve at sea. At convoy speed, the destroyers zigzagged sluggishly, unable to generate enough lateral movement to frustrate submarine tracking. And submarines were present. American boats had begun to concentrate near Cape Esperance, and each sonar, contact trio, or imagined to force the destroyers into sudden acceleration. The moment a captain pushed his engines past 15 knots, the destroyer leaped ahead like an uncoiled spring, leaving the convoy behind by hundreds, then thousands, of meters. When the emergency passed and speed dropped, the escorts had to idle at a near standstill to let the merchants catch up, creating long pauses in which they were neither scouting ahead nor protecting the column. Effectively, by mid-afternoon, the oscillation had become a pattern. Accelerate to 20 knots to evade a suspected submarine, then break back to 8. Surge forward under threat of aerial searchlights, then drift back into position. Each cycle widened temporary gaps in the screen, and as American reconnaissance aircraft appeared overhead, these gaps offered ready-made entry points for attack runs. When the convoy finally came under assault, first by bombers from Guadalcanal, then by patrol aircraft sweeping from the east, the slow transports could not maneuver out of danger. Japanese after-action reports described them as fixed points, incapable of turning fast enough to spoil bombing angles. What shocked staff officers in Rabaul was not only the loss of ships but the consistent observation, repeated across logs and testimonies. The destroyers could not defend the convoy at its speed, and they could not fight effectively at theirs. Stuck between two incompatible tempos, they drifted through December as symbols of a structural flaw the Navy could not repair. High Command memoranda from late in the month reveal a growing, dread realization that Japan no longer possessed the hulls to move reinforcements in bulk, and that, relying on slow transports would only produce further disasters. This admission pushed the Navy toward a drastic decision for early 1943 to abandon mixed convoys altogether and rely solely on destroyers for reinforcement, a choice that would expose even deeper cracks in the imperial supply system. January 1943 opened over the South Pacific with a damp, heavy heat that clung to steel decks and blurred the horizon into a pale smear. And in this atmosphere of exhaustion, the Imperial Navy made a final, fateful adjustment. All remaining attempts to shepherd slow convoys toward Guadalcanal were abandoned. The disasters of November and December had proven beyond debate that transports and barges could not survive American pressure. In their place, Combined Fleet ordered a shift to destroyer-only reinforcement runs, nocturnal sprints from Rabaul to Shortland and down the slot, where velocity rather than mass would now carry Japan's hopes of sustaining the 17th Army. What sounded like a clean tactical solution on paper quickly revealed itself as a strategic trap. Each destroyer sortie demanded sustained speeds of 30 knots or more, and at these velocities fuel disappeared at frightening rates. The forward squadrons operating from Shortland and Buin found their bunkers draining faster than tankers could refill them, and those tankers were themselves dwindling. American submarines, now active from the Celebes to the waters around Palau, had begun tearing holes in Japan's oil lifting network, sinking ships that the Navy could not replace. Every reinforcement run to Guadalcanal required destroyers to refuel before and after their sprint, creating a cycle in which more time was spent chasing fuel than delivering the rations, ammunition, and medical supplies that soldiers awaited in jungle foxholes. Maintenance suffered, crews slept in short, ragged intervals. The destroyers, once prized assets of the battle fleet, were now stripped of their torpedoes or carried reduced loads to make room for drum-packed cargo lashed across their decks. Engineers warned that a fully loaded destroyer became top-heavy in rough seas, its stability margins dangerously thin. Captains responded by reducing speed during but even throttled back, These ships could outrun any conventional convoy, eliminating the possibility of mixed formations and making the Navy's logistics increasingly dependent on single-platform delivery. By February 1943, the realization struck home in Tokyo and Rabaul with quiet, disbelieving force. Destroyers had become the single largest consumer of naval fuel in the South Pacific. A single high-speed run to Guadalcanal burned enough fuel to operate a cruiser squadron for days. Yet the cargo delivered, often only a few dozen tons, could not sustain the 17th Army for more than a fraction of its daily needs. Admirals reading the fuel ledgers understood the implication they had hoped to avoid. Speed could extract troops, but it could not nourish them. The crisis they had tried to outrun was now dictating strategy, setting the stage for the next stark turning point, the forced evacuation of Guadalcanal, where destroyers would finally demonstrate that they could carry soldiers away from battle, but could never supply the means to keep them there. The nights of early February 1943 carried a strange stillness over the approaches to Guadalcanal, a stillness broken only by the faint thunder of engines that rose and fell across the slot as Japan's destroyer squadrons hurled themselves into Operation Kitha, evacuation of an island they had once believed would anchor their southern advance. Shortly after sunset on the 1st of February, the first wave of destroyers, including Kuroshio, Oyashio, and Asa, raced southward from Shortland at speeds topping 30 knots, their wakes glowing with streaks of pale blue phosphorescence. These ships had made the run before, but never with a mission so somber, not to deliver ammunition or rations, but to extract the remnants of an army worn down by 6 months of starvation, disease, and relentless American pressure. The destroyer's speed, once intended to shield convoys by outmaneuvering enemy fire, now marked the final acknowledgement of Japan's strategic failure to supply the very troops they were rescuing. As the first groups neared Cape Esperance, they throttled back only long enough to begin rapid embarkation. Ragged soldiers, many hollow-eyed from malaria and hunger, boarded in near silence under blackout conditions while lookouts scanned for American patrols. In minutes, the destroyers swung north again, surging toward safety at speeds no barge, tender, or transport could ever hope to match. The cycle repeated across successive nights, each run bleeding fuel and pushing engines to their limits, with destroyers spending the brief daylight hours hidden among the Shortland anchorages while support vessels, vulnerable and essential, remained far behind, unable to participate, for the Army officers stepping onto the destroyer decks. The sleek silhouettes cutting back into open water symbolized both salvation and defeat. These ships were lifeboats, not lifelines. They could carry men away from a collapsing front, but they had never been able to deliver what the front needed to stand its ground. Combined fleets post-operation analyses were blunt. The Navy had demonstrated extraordinary skill in extraction, but the same speed that made destroyers invaluable during Operation KI had rendered them almost useless as sustainment vessels throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. They could outrun danger but also outran their own supply responsibilities, leaving heavier vessels unable to keep pace and leaving the Army to starve. This realization carried immediate weight in planning for the Central Solomons, as Japan shifted its focus northward to new defensive lines. The same imbalance between destroyer speed and logistical necessity loomed over every proposed reinforcement plan, an imbalance that would soon collide with an even more aggressive American naval presence, culminating in the devastating convoy disaster at Kula Gulf. Moonlight glittered across the narrow waters of Kula Gulf on the night of the 6th of July 1943, laying a pale sheen over the advancing Japanese reinforcement group as it threaded south toward New Georgia. At the head of the formation steamed the destroyer Mizuki, newly arrived and equipped with an advanced air search radar that Japanese planners hoped would give the convoy a rare defensive edge. Behind her came several troop-carrying destroyers Nagatsu, Mikazuki, Yonagi, their decks crowded with soldiers bound for the embattled Munda front. Trailing at the rear were two slower supply vessels, little more than militarized freighters, whose tired engines strained to hold even 12 knots. From the decks of these vessels the night seemed deceptively calm, but to experienced officers the stillness carried a familiar threat. American patrols were now operating freely across the Central Solomons, and any moonlit approach risked detection. That happened sooner than anticipated. Far to the east, the U.S. cruisers Helena, St. Louis, and Honolulu swept their radars across the Gulf with the detached precision of machines, detecting the Japanese column long before any human eye could pierce the night. As the American formation maneuvered to intercept, Japanese destroyer captains prepared for a textbook torpedo attack, the doctrine that had defined their training since before the war. When the first American illumination rounds burst overhead, the response was immediate. Engines roared, wakes flared white, and the destroyers surged forward at over 30 knots to launch long lance spreads into the darkness. That single acceleration shattered the convoy's cohesion. The high-speed destroyers, built to sprint and turn with razor-sharp agility, instantly outpaced the vulnerable supply vessels struggling at the rear. Nazuki, racing at the tip of the attack, absorbed the first barrage of American shells and sank with heavy loss of life. But it was the aftermath that revealed the deeper failure. While the Japanese destroyers slashed across the Gulf in torpedo runs, the slower vessels abandoned in the melee became stationary silhouettes against the moonlit water. American cruisers, unchallenged at close range, poured gunfire into them, sinking the transports with hundreds of troops still aboard before the destroyers could return to shield them. At Rabaul, the after-action reports arrived in grim succession. Commanders repeated the same conclusion seen after Tassafaronga, after the December convoys. After every mixed operation in the Solomons, the moment destroyers shifted into combat speed, the convoy disintegrated behind them. Reconnaissance photographs and radar plots captured the sequence with merciless clarity. Transports isolated in the center of the Gulf, destroyers far ahead, each group fighting its own battle, neither supporting the other. Kula Gulf was more than a tactical defeat. It was a reaffirmation of a structural flaw first feared months earlier. High-performance warships could not coexist with low-speed logistical vessels under modern firepower and radar. And yet, Japan would try again. The next reinforcement attempt, aimed at Kolombangara only days later, would confront the same contradiction under even harsher conditions, pushing the Imperial Navy toward another costly reckoning. The night of the 13th of July 1943 settled over the waters west of Kolombangara with a hard, metallic brightness, the moon shining so clearly that the ripples along each bow wave flickered like shards of glass. Into this illuminated danger zone moved another Japanese reinforcement, attempt only 9 days after the disaster at Kula Gulf, driven by the same desperate need to hold the Central Solomons. Admiral Izaki's force combined fast destroyers, including Satsuki Inazuma and Nagatsuki, with slower transports carrying reinforcements for the garrison at Vela. The troop vessel Kyokawa, heavy with men, lumbered forward at barely 11 knots, her engines shedding sparks in the humid night air. Even before contact, the imbalance felt familiar to the officers aboard her. The escorting destroyers could vanish into the darkness at will, but the transports would always remain exposed beneath the moon. Shortly before midnight, an urgent radar report from one of the screening destroyers confirmed the inevitable. American cruisers St. Louis and Leander were closing fast from the southeast, with S destroyers sweeping in from the east. Izaki's destroyer captains reacted instantly, throttling up to combat speed as doctrine demanded. Their bows lifted, engines roared, and the sleek silhouettes surged ahead to launch torpedoes at over 30 knots. The transports, at a fraction of that pace, were left behind almost at once. As the gun duel erupted between the opposing screening forces, the convoy's center of gravity shifted miles astray, leaving Kiyakawa Maru and her consorts to plow forward alone, stuck in the moonlit strait with no cover except their own thin hulls. American destroyers, closing from the east, found them quickly. Deprived of their escorts' shielding fire, the transports became stationary targets outlined against the pale water. Shells tore into Kyokawa Maru, igniting cargo holds and scattering troops into the sea. Reports from the few survivors described the attack as sudden and overwhelming, the ship breaking apart while the destroyers that had led the formation fought their own battle far ahead. When Izaki's escorts attempted to return, their very speed worked against them. High-velocity maneuvers in the tight coastal waters produced chaotic approaches, forcing them to weave around reefs and currents that ruined any chance of forming a protective screen. The intelligence summaries compiled at Rabaul in the following days read like an indictment of Japan's entire Solomon Islands strategy. Analysts noted with stark bluntness that destroyers operating at combat speed inevitably created structural gaps in mixed formations, gaps that American radar and cruiser firepower exploited with lethal precision. Even flawless seamanship could not overcome the physics of mismatched performance. Kolombangara thus became the final proof of a truth already visible at Tassafaronga, in the December convoys, and at Kula Gulf. The Imperial Navy lacked a workable method to deliver troops or supplies through contested waters, when its fastest ships could not remain with its slowest. 4 senior admirals. The paired failures of Kula Gulf and Kolombangara marked a decisive shift. Japan's attempts to reinforce the Central Solomons had been broken by an enemy growing stronger each month, and by a logistical system that could no longer survive its own contradictions. From this point forward, Japanese strategy tilted toward withdrawal and defense, as American forces advanced relentlessly northward, toward Bougainville. August 1943 settled over Rabaul, with a damp, unmoving heat that seemed to press down on every office, chart, table, and signal room, mirroring the weight gathering inside the minds of Japan's senior naval officers. The losses of the previous month's Tassafaronga, the December convoys, Kula Gulf, Kolombangara had left more than a trail of sunken holes. They had carved a growing gulf between what the Imperial Navy believed its destroyers could do and what they had actually become. These ships, celebrated since the 1930s as the world's fastest torpedo platforms, had been designed to spearhead night attacks and carve open battle lines. Yet, by mid-1943, officers at Rabaul and Truk increasingly spoke in subdued tones about a different image. Destroyers, racing ahead while transports burned behind them, their speed no longer a weapon but a symbol of the logistics the Navy could not protect. Internal memoranda circulated that month reveal a private despair, rarely expressed in official wartime communications. Junior officers described watching convoys disintegrate the moment destroyers accelerated, leaving soldiers adrift or trapped aboard sinking vessels. Some wrote that embarked troops stared at the retreating silhouettes with a look they could not forget, an expression of abandonment that cut deeper than any formal reprimand. Veteran destroyer captains, in entries later recovered from personal journals, confessed that they felt trapped by the same unsolvable equation: to hold position at 8 or 10 knots was to invite submarine or radar-directed gunfire. To maneuver at their natural 30-knot pace was to abandon the mission itself. This tension eroded the psychological foundations of Japanese naval doctrine. At staff meetings in Rabaul, admirals who had once championed destroyer-led operations now questioned whether their fleet's finest ships had become strategically misapplied tools, too fast to guard convoys, too precious to risk, yet too vital to withdraw. The Army, sensing weakness, pressed its own accusations. Officers at the front charged that the Navy cared more about preserving hulls than sustaining soldiers, a claim that ignited old inter-service resentments and widened the divide between Japan's two fighting branches. Strategic planners understood that morale was deteriorating because the logistical framework no longer matched the tempo of combat. Destroyers could fight fiercely, but they could not deliver the supplies required to maintain forces in the Solomons. This recognition forced the Navy to consider alternatives it had once viewed as inferior: barge fleets creeping along the coastlines, air-covered shuttle runs, and dispersed night movements designed to stretch the thin logistics net without relying on ships too fast for the burden they carried. These experiments, born of psychological as much as material exhaustion, would shape the next phase of Japan's struggle to hold the northern SOLOMONs. By the final months of 1943, the waters around Buja and the northern Solomons reflected a harsh new reality for the Imperial Navy. The destroyers that had once symbolized speed, power, and night-fighting supremacy were now largely withdrawn from routine convoy duty, their role reduced by the very imbalance that had doomed Japan's supply efforts for more than a year. In their place came an improvised patchwork of small craft, motorized barges creeping through coastal shallows, subchasers clattering across short supply lanes, and tiny wooden boats laden with sacks of rice that sloshed in the bilges as they lurched through the surf. These vessels formed a fragile shuttle network, intended not to deliver decisive reinforcements but simply to slow the collapse of isolated garrisons as American forces pushed deeper into the Solomons chain. The Army, desperate to keep forward positions alive, pressed for greater use of submarines as cargo carriers. Submarine commanders objected, but the High Command overruled them, believing the stealth of undersea craft would compensate for the impossibility of surface transport. The results were predictably marginal. A submarine could haul a few tons of medical supplies or ammunition, nowhere near what a single pre-war transport could move and each run. Diverted boats badly needed for reconnaissance and fleet defense. Worse still, submarine losses were rising in the South Pacific, and every boat assigned to cargo duty eroded Japan's diminishing operational flexibility. Attempts to integrate air cover from Rabaul also faltered. As American airfields spread across New Georgia, Vella La Vella, and Bougainville, Japanese fighter escorts struggled even to reach the convoys they were meant to shield. Pilots wrote with growing frustration that by the time they arrived over a supply lane, the barges below had already been attacked or forced ashore. By November and December 1943, many surface movements included no destroyers at all, a tacit admission that their speed rendered them useless as convoy escorts under constant threat from radar-equipped cruisers, submarines, and patrol bombers. Instead, destroyers were preserved for night skirmishes or dispatched to recover survivors from shattered barges left smoldering along jungle coastlines. These adaptations, though sometimes ingenious, exposed the deeper strategic collapse that Japanese officers could no longer deny. Japan had lost the ability to move heavy equipment, artillery, or large troop formations across contested waters. Destroyers could still fight, submarines could still sink ships, barges could still creep from cove to cove, but none of these assets could sustain a campaign. As American forces advanced toward the Bismarck Archipelago, the lesson hardened into final clarity. The failure of convoy viability had ended Japan's ability to wage offensive war in the South Pacific, marking the beginning of the long defensive retreat that would shape the closing reflections of the conflict. In the final months of 1943, as the front lines contracted and the Solomons campaign slipped irreversibly from Japan's grasp, senior naval officers began to confront the deeper meaning of the defeats that had accumulated across a year of night battles. shattered convoys, and impossible supply missions. What emerged from their reflections was not simply regret over tactical miscalculations, but recognition of a structural flaw woven into the very fabric of Japan's naval doctrine. The destroyers that had been the pride of the fleet, fast and armed with the formidable long-lance torpedo, had proven unable to compensate for a merchant fleet too slow, too small and too fragile to sustain far-flung garrisons. Time and again, after-action reports described the same haunting image. Destroyers accelerating into the darkness while the transports behind them burned, their speed transforming from an asset into an emblem of logistical collapse. Looking back, admirals understood that the fleet's greatest strength had gradually become its undoing. High-speed reinforcement runs delivered supplies in quantities too small to matter, while mixed convoys disintegrated the moment combat began. The destroyer's unmatched velocity, intended to dominate battle, instead widened the gulf between combat capability and logistical necessity. Officers who had watched these missions unfold at Guadalcanal, Tassafaranga, and Kulagulf carried a quiet bitterness, convinced that brilliance in night fighting had masked a fatal neglect of the mundane but essential work of sustaining armies. Across ocean distances. In post-war former staff officers spoke with unusual frankness. Speed, daring, and technical superiority could win battles. They wrote, but without a balanced logistical system they could never win a campaign. The Solomons had shown this with stark clarity. True naval power requires not only the ability to strike, but the ability to sustain. A lesson written in the nights when Japanese destroyers outran the very convoys they were sworn to protect.